So for the past week, I've been helping some of my IRL friends who have recently come back to the game clear all of the Destiny 2 raids. It's been a really cool experience seeing them take on some of these challenges for the first time and eventually succeed, even if some of the encounters don't go so smooth. I thought it was a good opportunity to compare all of the raid encounters that we currently have in the game as of summer 2020 and rank them into a tier list. Some of the raids are pretty short while others are a little bit longer, so I thought it made more sense to rank each raid encounter separately instead of comparing entire raids to each other. As far as deciding which parts of each raid should be considered to be an encounter, here's the criteria that I came up with. In order to be eligible, it has to be lootable at the end of the scenario. This means that it can include puzzle chests that require a mechanic to unlock and loot, but secret chests that only require jumping would not count. So for example, the ball throwing puzzle in the Spire of Stars is in, but the first hidden chest in the Last Wish, which is on the bridge, would be out. Hopefully that makes sense to you. I also decided to consider the prestige version of the Leviathan for the final rankings instead of just the normal mode, since it includes some extra hurdles to jump through, as well as doing Riven legit with all of the mechanics instead of the cheese method where you burn her health down quickly and skip the mechanics. As far as the rankings, I chose to go with the typical S through F tier list. Here's what each ranking actually means. S tier would be God tier, some of the most interesting encounter design in the entire game. A tier is super fun with very engaging mechanics that typically require a high level of teamwork. B tier would be pretty fun overall and interesting but not mind-blowing mechanics. C tier is kind of boring, mechanics maybe don't require a whole bunch of movement or thought. D tier would be actually boring content, mechanics that nearly put you to sleep. And finally, F tier would be how exactly did this make it into a AAA game? So with the rankings and rules out of the way, let's dig into the tier list. We're going to cover the raids in the order that they came into the game, starting with the Leviathan, everyone's favorite gigantic Cabal spaceship. The first encounter for the Leviathan is the Castellum. The main mechanic here is to find a door that requires 3 keys to be inserted in order to open, which can be found from each of the other doors in the giant room. Typically you'll have a small group running around hunting for keys, while the other group stays home to defend the plate and prevent Cabal from stealing the keys that you've already planted and resetting your progress. Overall, this is a decent encounter and it's pretty fun, but it is quite simple. I think it's a good encounter for opening up a raid, but not really much beyond that. My number one gripe is a small but I think important thing. Why can't we melee enemies with these giant keys? That's a huge miss in my opinion. I'm going to put this one in the C tier. Now with the Leviathan, there's a random order for all the rest of the encounters each week, except for Calus, which is always last. So the next one I'm going to cover is the Royal Pools, otherwise known as the Baths. The main mechanic here is to raise 3 groups of purple lanterns up in the air in the middle of the room so that your group can destroy them. You do this by standing on a plate in the 4 corners of the room, which raise the lanterns and make a chime when it's ready to go for the damage phase. The catch is that the water is toxic, and in order to stand in it, you need a buff called Psionic Protection, which decays over time. This forces your group to rotate in a relay race style format to pass the buff around. Overall, I think the Baths is a pretty decent encounter, and to me it's a pretty middle of the road mechanic that's fun but not too crazy for the middle of a raid. It's not terribly complicated, but it does involve some movement, ad killing, and a DPS check, albeit one that was much more threatening when the game first launched than it is today. I'm going to rank this one in the B tier. Next up is the Pleasure Gardens, also known as dogs. In this encounter, your goal is to eliminate 6 dogs in the normal mode, or 8 in the prestige version. You're given 2 crystals that reflect light from the sky into flowers on the ground, which are randomly activated. Your team's goal is to carefully sneak spore balls around the map to find these activated flowers, and have your crystal wielding teammates shoot the flower in order to give your team a damage buff. Stack as many of these buffs as you can before the dogs become restless and the damage phase begins. Each dog has a set path through the arena where it patrols. If you get detected early, it will also trigger a damage phase, which can be a problem if you don't have many damage stacks yet. I find the dogs encounter to be pretty interesting and clever from a design standpoint. I like the stealth component, and it's pretty fun to be up top with the crystal, directing teammates below to find the different flowers. It also gets each member of the team doing something, which I think is a plus. These days, the dogs are much easier to kill than they first were with a double primary meta, but I still think it's a reasonably fun encounter. It's really cool to get a ton of damage stacks and then absolutely melt the dogs with our overpowered abilities. I'm going to rank this one in the B tier. Next up is the Gauntlet. Here, the goal is to get a runner through the full rotation of the outer ring, which has 3x3 hole barriers which are locked and can't be passed through until teammates on the inner ring shoot the corresponding arrows correctly. If done too slowly, the runner can pass through, but has a timer where he or she will likely die unless your team can get to the next set of arrows and complete them quickly. Players in the inside ring are tasked with jumping on pillars which inform the runner of what to call out, and scions that must be killed before they trigger a wipe. This cycle of events must happen 3 times successfully while clearing a wave of ads before each run. If all 3 are cleared, then the whole team is required to run around the outer ring and escape to the middle to dunk their charges. In the Prestige mode, players must accomplish all 3 roles, being the runner, jumper, and puncher, which adds a little bit more intrigue to the entire encounter. I think the Gauntlet overall is a really cool fight, and I especially like the extra challenge of juggling roles in the Prestige mode. However, the lack of a boss kind of holds it back in my eyes. The main thing going for it for me is that in Prestige mode, it gets every single player involved in moving around, which I think is really cool, and it makes it pretty fun. I'm going to rank it in the B tier. And finally we have the Throne, where we fight Emperor Calus, or rather a robot version of him. This fight, which is the conclusion of the base Leviathan raid, is also the most complex. After Calus claps his hands, the team will be summoned into the Void Room. Here there will be orbs for 3 members to teleport back into the Throne Room. Calus will show symbols on his head in the Void Room, which corresponds to scions that need to be punched in the Throne Room. The missing symbol is the one that needs to be killed. After a few successful rounds of this, Calus' giant head will start spitting out skulls in the Void Room that need to be shot in order to gain damage stacks, while the team inside the Throne Room needs to stay alive long enough to build up those stacks and eventually break Calus' shield. With the whole team back in the Throne Room, everyone will jump on plates to deal damage until he activates an attack in order to get you off of the plate. You have 4 total plates to use for damage, and once they're used up, you'll need to repeat the whole fight if you haven't dealt enough damage yet to kill him. Once you do manage to kill the boss, there's a final shield mechanic where you must break it in order to finish the fight. In Prestige mode, the player punching the scions will get teleported back into the Void Room, and a random Void Room player will get put back into the Throne Room, which adds a little bit more interest to the whole fight and keeps players more engaged. Overall, I think this is a really fun fight, and it was an appropriate end to the first raid. I don't think it's terribly complicated, but the Prestige mode adds a little bit more intrigue by keeping everyone activated and only allowing 2 players to stay in the Throne Room to be safe the whole time. I also like the extra risk of letting Calus' shield stay alive a little bit longer to gain those extra damage stacks. I'm going to put this one in the A tier. Next up is the raid Eater of Worlds. The first encounter here is Escape the Reactor. You must jump one by one on a series of platforms to progress from one side of the giant ship underbelly to the other. The first series of jumps are incredibly straightforward, literally just progressing one at a time forwards. Later sections force you to split up going left and right, and then finally there's a tricky one where you have to jump over one of the platforms since they spawn in a little bit less straightforward manner. Once you finally reach the other side of the room, you actually get to do something fun and kill a few waves of enemies. Overall, I think this opening jumping puzzle is a complete embarrassment to the franchise, and I'm pretty surprised that it made it into the game. It's incredibly boring, and one of the main reasons I'm not usually in the mood to run Eater of Worlds more often. I'm going to rank this one in the absolute lowest tier, F tier. Next up is Delve Deeper. This encounter is 2 parts. The first is a simple puzzle where you need to time your progression through a room so that you're safely in a corner whenever a flash of electricity hits. You can choose to take your time and go section by section, or if you're a pro gamer, you can skip a few and take your chances living dangerously. Once you've cleared the electricity room, you're loaded into a gigantic gun barrel and shot into a downward maze puzzle where you must dodge a bunch of floating rocks and reach the ground. If you manage to activate each of the floating rings by falling through them, you'll also activate a secret loot chest. This pair of mechanics is pretty simple and really not all that fun, but at least it's less dreadful than the jumping puzzle, which opens up the raid. Also, the skybox when you're falling through the rings puzzle is pretty cool looking. I'm going to put this one in the D tier. Next up is Break the Barrier. In this encounter, your goal is to remove the barrier shield around the final boss, Argos. You do this by charging Vex craniums with either solar, arc, or void energy, and shooting the craniums into the corresponding mines of the barrier shield. If you're not able to destroy the mines before they explode, you wipe. This fight requires a decent amount of communication between members to coordinate which elements are required to be charged, as well as a significant amount of ad clear. Overall, I think it's a pretty fun fight and I do like the mechanics. It's a solid lead up to the final boss where it teaches the mechanics that will be required, but kind of in a fun way. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. And finally we have Destroy Argos, which is the final boss of the raid. In this final boss encounter, we have the same Vex cranium charging mechanic from the previous fight, but this time we use the charged Vex craniums to unzip the shield on Argos in order to trigger the damage phase. Similar to the previous encounter, you need to coordinate which elements to charge based on the shield elements that are shown on Argos. You can choose to either do 2 damage phases or just a shorter damage phase and use the additional charged craniums for extra damage. During the boss phase, you'll have to contend with exploding harpies that rush towards you as well as nets that will try to capture your allies. And if people get captured, it's going to require you to shoot them out of the air. If you don't deal enough damage for a kill outright, you'll need to jump on some floating platforms in the air and deal enough damage as a group to break the various glowing spots on Argos. Failing to break 2 of those spots will result in a wipe. Succeeding to break these spots will reset the whole fight, and you'll be starting over at the beginning while charging up the craniums and unzipping his shield again. I think Argos is a really fun fight, especially when trying to do it with less than 6 people. The mechanics are really engaging and it keeps players moving around the map. There's also a decent amount of adds to worry about, so you have to be fighting pretty continuously. Players who are really on the ball can manage multiple sections at a time, which is really fun to do. It reminds me a little bit of the last encounter of the Wrath of the Machine raid in Destiny 1, where you're fighting Axis and a single talented player can manage multiple mechanics at the same time. I'm going to rank the Argos fight in the A tier. Our next raid to cover is the Spire of Stars, and our first encounter is Accept Calus' Gift. The fight takes place in the Statue Garden. The objective here is to raise 4 pillars by standing on them with a ball. You can only stand on the pillar for a short time before you get too many greed stacks and you die. So the key here is the speed of passing the ball around to your teammates on each of the 4 pillars quickly. If you take too long, the pillars will start to sink, and once you've raised all of the pillars, the shield in the middle disappears and you can throw the ball into the center structure. Complete this sequence 3 times and you win. I think this is a pretty fun opening encounter. It's one of the better opening fights in any of the raids. It keeps at least 4 of the players in a fire team pretty engaged, and it's fun to throw the ball around quickly. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. Next up is Reach the Central Observatory. This part is another hidden chess puzzle that requires a mechanic to unlock it. You must pass a ball around that has greed and activate a number of stations throughout the long upwards jumping puzzle. Typically, this involves long ball throws from teammate to teammate, which is a lot of fun. Similar to the first encounter, you can't hold onto a ball too long by yourself, because if it reaches 10 stacks of greed, you'll die. However, there are a few methods to carry it solo with some workarounds. If you successfully get the ball all the way to the end of the puzzle and dunk it, you'll get a secret chest. I think the ball throwing is especially fun here in this mechanic, and it always makes for a few laughs when you're going for some really long tosses. Overall, it's a pretty simple but fun mechanic. I'm going to put this one in the C tier. Next up we have Stop Val Ca'our's Fleet. This is the fight that teaches you the mechanics required for the final boss. After you clear the starting enemies, your team will stand on all 4 plates to activate the central lift. One player with the superior retainer buff teleports up the lift into space and calls out a symbol shown on the ship. Once back in the room, players stand on the 3 inner buttons to open up the doors. One player will grab the ball, grab the mist on the ball platform in order to greed the ball, and then throws it into the door that the superior retainer player called out. If done correctly, you'll see a message that you're armed and you're ready to destroy the ship. Once again, players will stand on the 4 outer plates in order to activate the lift, and then the superior retainer player grabs the ball and greeds it with the mist, and then enters the lift to teleport into space, and throws the ball at the correct ship. With a successful hit, you'll see the ship get destroyed. This process needs to be repeated a total of 3 times to destroy all 3 ships. I really like the mechanics of this fight. I think it does a great job teaching the elements that will be required in the final boss fight, and it gets most of the team moving around and engaged. Throwing the ball at the ship and seeing it explode in the back of the skybox is really cool too. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. And finally we have the boss, Neutralize Val Ca'our. The objective here is to take out the boss using many of the same mechanics learned in the previous fight. After clearing adds and passing a ball to each member to remove the engulf debuff and then throwing it at the boss, players will stand on the outer plates to activate the lift. The superior retainer player goes into space and calls out the symbols that they see just like the previous encounter, but this time there's going to be 2 ships marked with symbols. Players stand on the inner buttons to open up the doors while 2 players get the balls, greed them in the mist, and then throw the balls into the correct sockets in order to arm them. Next, players will stand on the outer plates to activate the lift again, and the 2 superior retainer players grab the balls, greed them in the mist, fly up into outer space, and then throw the balls into the ships to destroy them. After both ships are destroyed, 3 balls will enter the arena one at a time, which need to be greeded and then passed back and forth to prevent dying from that greed, until it's time to throw them at Calus in the back of the map. This triggers a damage phase where you can kill the boss in one cycle pretty easily these days. Once you manage to delete his health bar, you need to grab all 6 of the balls that are thrown into the arena and throw them at Val Ca'our to finish him off. I think this fight is one of the best in the entire game. It gets people moving all around the arena, requires really clear communication, good ad clear, managing several mechanics in a timely manner, and a DPS check. Many people claim that this encounter is really buggy, and maybe at times it is, but I think most of the time it can be explained by some partially missed mechanics. There's a lot to manage at the same time, and it's pretty easy to accidentally make an incorrect callout or forget to greed one of the balls when you first get it. To me, this encounter falls just short of S tier, and I'm going to rank it A+. I'm almost tempted to go higher, but I don't think it's quite on the same level as another encounter coming up soon. Okay, on to my personal favorite raid, The Last Wish. Our first encounter here is Kalli the Corrupted. Here, players need to activate plates on the outer sections of the arena, which correspond to symbols on the inner rings of the boss room, and open up doors during the damage phase. Once all plates are cleared, players move to the middle to damage Kalli. After a brief DPS window, She'll do an attack that wipes the entire room unless you hide in those doors under her that you unlock during the standing on the plates phase in the beginning. You have a few of these damage windows to kill her, and if you don't succeed, you'll need to go back to the outer plates again and repeat all of the mechanics. I think Kalli is an awesome fight to start this raid. My first clear of this fight on day 1 when this raid first came out is one of my most memorable raid experiences in all of Destiny. I'll play the highlight for you here where my friend Rummy clutches up with literally 0 seconds left on the clock to kill Kalli.
I don't know if I'll make it. Probably won't make it. Not making it.
No f***ing A, dude.
Alright.
I was so close.
Grenades on the ads.
30 seconds, you guys got
Yeah.
that.
Dude, you can, boys. Come on.
No, don't, you bitch.
Rummy commit. Rummy commit. Oh shit! Holy f***! That was so close!
This fight includes a lot of movement with responsibilities for each player and a decent amount of individual performance required to handle the plates solo. However, compared to many other raid fights, the mechanics are pretty simple. I'm going to rank this one in the B tier. Next up is Shuro Chi the Corrupted. In this fight, players must ascend a 3-level arena with a massive amount of ad clear throughout. There are 6 total platforms where the boss Shuro Chi will stand and serve as a mini DPS check. To deal damage, you must first synchronize shooting 3 crystals in a triangle shape while standing on the plates to break her shield. Dealing enough damage will move her to the next location. After DPS phases 2 and 4, there's a puzzle that must be solved involving 9 total plates that can be stood on briefly. You must use these plates to fill in the missing puzzle pieces on the wall. However, you can only activate each plate once per person, so it requires some communication from your team to swap plates and roles occasionally. There's also a bit of a jumping puzzle required to climb the platforms that flip over after a short period of time. If you get all the way through to the 6 DPS check and kill Shuro Chi, you win. I think this is one of the coolest non-final boss fights of any raid. It requires a ton of team coordination to manage the puzzles properly, and DPS phases that were really intense when the raid first came out. There's a lot of pressure to get all of the mechanics handled, or else the dread of having to start all the way over at the very beginning. I'm going to put Shuro Chi in the A tier. I think it's one of the most fun and hectic fights in the game that doesn't involve a final raid boss. Next up is Morgeth, the Spirekeeper. Here, players must collect blights that appear throughout the arena and grant the debuff Taken Strength. Ordinarily, players can only grab 2 blights and stay alive, while a third will kill you and release the Taken Strength back to the arena. However, there are a few workarounds for this. Players with 2 blights collected are subject to being stuck in a vortex trap that will lock you in place until you're cleansed by a teammate wielding the artifact that drops from killing the Eye of Riven. Once enough blights are collected, it will trigger a damage phase where you can shoot the pustules on Morgeth's back to deal damage. If you deal enough damage, you win, which is quite easy to do these days with a variety of safe strategies using a Well of Radiance. To me, Morgeth is an interesting concept, but probably the weakest encounter in Last Wish. The fight is not all that engaging, but it does require a little bit of communication to make sure that the cleanses happen in time and the blights are all collected. I'm going to rank Morgeth down in the C tier. Next up we have the Vault. Here, players read symbols that appear on the middle structure while standing on the 3 plates outside of the jungle, rocks, and dark stairs sections of the map. The way in which these symbols appear allows you to decode whether each plate should be cleansed with a Penumbra or Antumbra buff that is received from the artifact dropped by the Eye of Riven in each section. Each of the 3 plates needs to be cleansed before the Vault security mechanism timer expires. Doing so will complete the round successfully, and 3 total rounds are required for victory. I've always thought the Vault was one of the most interesting puzzles ever introduced in a raid. And still to this day, it blows me away that the first group to clear this encounter on day 1 of the raid race was by Ninji's team brute force guessing the right buffs. That's just absolutely crazy to me. This encounter requires a mix of ad clear and concise communication to win, which is always a plus in my book. The main thing holding it back is any sort of a final boss or DPS requirement, outside of those yellow bar knights that try to wipe you by sticking their swords in the plates. These days, those knights don't really pose much of a threat, but when the raid first launched, they were a pretty common reason for wiping. I'm going to put the Vault up in the A tier. And lastly, we have our final boss, Riven. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm ranking this encounter based on doing all of the mechanics the legit way, instead of bypassing them with the DPS burn strategy that almost all groups do these days. Very briefly, here's how the whole fight works. Teams activate 6 plates to start the encounter and split into 2 groups, one going to the blue crystal side and the other going to the green wood side. Depending on RNG, Riven will appear on one side first and then either have a fire breathing mechanic or a tentacle slamming mechanic. Successfully completing whichever mechanic shows up will force Riven to show 2 out of the 10 possible eyes, which need to be communicated with the other squad. The other group then waits for Riven to appear on their side, deals as much DPS as possible, then waits for those eyes to appear. You need to correctly shoot out the 2 eyes to prevent a wipe. Meanwhile, each group also needs to activate a portal to climb to the next level by syncing up an Eye of Riven charge with a symbol that's only visible to a player behind a pane of glass. If 2 rounds of this are completed successfully, all 6 players will be able to come all the way up to the surface level, where they fight Riven together, who is once again doing either the fire or the tentacle attack, and then showing the 2 eyes. After 3 rounds of this, it will be another damage phase, followed by 6 total eyes being shown that each need to be shot. If this is performed correctly, you'll be able to fall back down to the bottom while shooting pustules on Riven's back that deal a lot of damage. If you still haven't done enough damage to push Riven to that dark line in her health bar, you're going to have to repeat the whole process again. Once you do hit that health marker, she'll teleport the whole group into the Ascendant Plane, where you need to complete a jumping puzzle and then reach the top before your health decays to 0. Once back in the boss room, you'll have another damage phase where you need to kill Riven's remaining health. And finally, at the very end, you need to climb in through her mouth and kill her heart to complete the entire fight. Phew, what an encounter. The entire Riven sequence is truly a masterpiece. It's one of the most mechanic-heavy fights I've ever seen in an MMO game, and it requires a combination of personal ability to manage adds, clear communication around a number of mechanics including shooting the eyes, baiting the tentacles, calling out symbols, as well as a number of DPS checks. To me, it's a clear winner for the most impressive mechanic design in the history of Destiny, and it deserves a top spot in the S tier. And that wraps up for Last Wish. Oh, wait, there's still another encounter before you're done. I'm sure Dado's 2402 squad will likely remember this one for a long time. Our final encounter is actually the Queenswalk, where you essentially take the Heart of Riven backwards through the raid. One player is randomly selected to grab the heart with a buff called Fate's Chosen and gets teleported to within the heart that they're holding after 15 seconds. Then another player is chosen to pick up the heart and carry it. This process continues to repeat while members one by one are teleported inside the heart, leaving less people on the outside to carry the heart. The players inside the heart can pick up blights that extend the timer of the heart carrier once each of the blights are collected. Meanwhile, on the outside there's a debuff called Creeping Darkness, which is only cleared by standing within the dome-shaped aura emanating from the heart. The last player needs to reach the tachyons and deposit the heart before the time expires in order to win the encounter. I think putting this encounter after Riven is equal parts genius and evil. I can't even imagine how the first group to beat Riven must have felt thinking they had cleared the entire raid only to get stuck in the Queenswalk. The mechanics here are not really that complicated, but they do typically require at least some participation from all members of the group, and that can be pretty rough for a lot of LFG groups. It's another encounter that requires clear communication and callouts, and a lot of ad clear. Overall, I think it's a clever end to the best raid in Destiny that we have so far, but by itself it's kind of a middle of the pack encounter. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. Okay, with Last Wish completed, we're on to a much shorter raid with Scourge of the Past. Our first encounter is called Berserker. Killing a yellow bar Berserker drops a radiant battery that powers the map. You can then use the map to locate specific Berserkers to get more batteries that keep the middle of the map alive, and also deposit them in 4 different locations around the city in each of the cardinal directions. Complete this cycle enough times and you win, allowing you to drop into the sewer puzzle. Okay, I'm really impressed with the visuals of the map mechanic. When I first ran this raid, I was so impressed with it. I also really like how the Berserkers require some teamwork to get on both sides of them in order to break the shield. Little touches of teamwork like that are really cool to me. This encounter requires a decent amount of communication with your map team so that you know where to go to kill the Berserkers as well as where to dunk the batteries. I think this one's a solid B tier encounter. Next up is one of the crazier encounters in the entire raid, Escape. After simultaneously punching 2 panels to start the encounter, a giant servitor chases you through a crazy Sparrow race with many obstacles to navigate. There are also hidden buttons that you can activate throughout the raid that opens up a secret door that leads to a hidden chest to loot. If you fall too far behind, you're burned to death by the giant servitor and forced to watch your teammates try to salvage the run. I think the Sparrow race is a really cool idea and it's super fun. It's not crazy mechanic heavy by any means, but it's always a lot of laughs when you're running this with friends and bumping into each other. It makes me miss the days of the Sparrow Racing League, and I think it's really cool that Bungie allows us to use Sparrows in this raid for a little bit of a change of pace. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. Next up is Insurrection Prime Phase 1. Here, you grab charges from the underground arena to power up tanks that can be used to damage the boss in the middle of the arena. I love the system they created with the buffs in this fight, where you need to grab a particular buff and be careful not to overlap with allies who have a different buff. It's also cool how they allow your group to split up into a top and bottom section. The top has a lot of ad management to take care of, while the bottom is a little bit less so, but deaths can really cost you on the timing. It also requires some communication with the upstairs team to kill the servitor at the right time, so that you stop the electricity, preventing you from coming back upstairs, and then also recharge those phase machines below. I think it's a really fun fight, but the mechanics are not that crazy overall. It's just a good introduction to the mechanics required for that final boss fight. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. And lastly, we have our final boss, Insurrection Prime Part 2. This fight makes use of both the map mechanic from the start of the raid, as well as the phase synergy that we learned from our previous encounter. The map team calls out based on where they see the Berserkers spawning that need to be killed in order to pick up the batteries, as well as where those batteries need to be dunked in order to retrieve a tank. Meanwhile, the boss has some shield weak points that need to be shot by the rest of your team in order to take down the shield. Once the boss is in a good spot, you can shoot him with the tank to lock him in place and trigger the damage phase. Here, the synergy mechanic from the previous encounter kicks in. Your team needs to quickly position themselves to pair up either angular, continuous, or parallel in order to receive some bonus damage, as well as preventing your group from hurting each other with an incorrect phase matchup. I've always loved this mechanic. It reminds me of one of my favorite fights in the Elder Scrolls Online, the twins fight in the Law of Morgeth trial, where you also get a frequently swapping color buff that hurts allies if you get too close with a different color. With the communication required to manage the map component, as well as the coordination in the DPS phase, I think this fight deserves a spot in the A tier. Our next raid to cover is the Crown of Sorrow. The first encounter here is the Witch's Ritual. Oh boy, everyone's favorite raid opening encounter that lasts about 100% longer than it should. Here, you need to manage a buff called Witch's Blessing, which allows you to damage certain enemies that are protected against players without the buff. The catch is that the buff only lasts for 60 seconds and needs to be swapped between teammates frequently by damaging a vessel. If you still have it when the 60 seconds are up, you'll die. During this encounter, you have a number of high priority enemies including yellow bar ogres, which are some of the more threatening in the arena, as well as crystals that spawn and need to be damaged by a buffed and non-buffed player at the same time in order to destroy them. When doing my research for this video and taking a poll of the favorite and least favorite raid encounters from my friends, this one came up frequently as the absolute least favorite in the entire game. I think the main criticism is that it lasts just way too long and gets really boring. I think if it was only about half of the duration, people wouldn't have nearly as much issue with it. I don't really think the mechanics are awful by any means, but the whole thing just lasts way too long. I have a hard time putting it as low as the first encounter of Eater of Worlds, which I truly think is an embarrassment to the game, but this one's not far above it. I'm going to give this one a D-, and that's probably generous. Next up is the Kingdom of Sorrow jumping puzzle. Here, your team needs to jump across the map using a series of pillars. There are crystals that spawn in the air and need to be shot by both a buffed and non-buffed player at the same time, just like the previous encounter, as well as some that are shielded in a bubble like the Scions from the base Leviathan raid. Once again, you need to swap your buffs frequently so that you don't run out of time on the clock, and once you get to the other side of the chasm, you win and get your loot. I don't think this is a great encounter by any means, but it feels appropriate to me for a jumping puzzle with loot, and it's definitely more fun than the opening encounter since you at least do get to move around quite a bit. I'm going to put this one down in the C tier. Next up is Gahlran's Deception. Similar to the Spire of Stars, this encounter teaches you some of the mechanics that you'll need for the final boss. Teams of 2 will each take a section of the map to defend. After killing adds and passing back and forth the Witch's Blessing buff using the vessel, you'll eventually get to a damage phase. Here, a buffed and non-buffed player together need to punch Gahlran's Deception so that you can deal damage. If you deal enough damage to kill him, you win, otherwise you're doing more cycles of the same fight. Overall, I think this is a decent encounter, and I tend to like when raids introduce you to a mechanic that you'll need to be using in a later fight. It's cool that it puts pressure on a team of 2 to work together. I generally do like it when everyone on the team is engaged in an activity. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. And lastly, we have the final boss, Gahlran. After killing all the adds and flipping the buff back and forth using the vessel, and then killing the crystals when they spawn, you'll eventually get to the point where Gahlran's Deception is in your section again. This time, you and your teammate will both punch him at the same time, and then you'll shoot Gahlran's hand when it glows green, causing him to slam the ground, which destroys the deception if he's in a good spot. Once all 3 of the deceptions are defeated, you'll get to my favorite callout in any raid, which is Pepe Hands, where you'll shoot both of Gahlran's hands as they glow green, and then shoot his face to damage him. 2 of the 3 will disappear and reveal which one is the real boss. Then you group up on the final one for the damage phase. Once again, you'll shoot the Pepe Hands to stun him, and then shoot his head to deal damage. Repeat this back and forth until the damage phase ends. If you deal enough damage here, you win the encounter, otherwise you're going to be repeating the whole sequence again. As far as boss fights go, I think this one's actually pretty fun. It gets everyone on the team involved, which is something I really like, and it does require a lot of buff management to pass that Witch's Blessing back and forth. In particular, I really love how you can save an awkward run with good communication when a buff teammate standing outside of the vessel area can shoot it to pass the buff to another teammate without swapping. It allows you to really think on your toes and save a run that might not be going so well. I think this one belongs up in the A tier. And finally, we have the most recent raid, Garden of Salvation. The opening encounter here is Evade the Consecrated Mind. Here you will start the fight by tethering your way from the floating box to the door. One team will run ahead and open the next door by defeating an angelic and then tethering the door again, while the other team stays back with the Consecrated Mind to babysit him and pick up the voltaic overload to prevent a wipe. Repeat this process by leapfrogging groups all the way to the end and you win the encounter. Overall, I think this is a really cool opening fight to a raid and it's really fun. The main frustrations typically are when one team isn't doing their job fast enough and you have to keep sacrificing bodies to pick up more and more of those voltaic overloads in order to prevent a wipe, since you haven't had your own debuff reset yet. I'm going to put this one in the B tier. Next up is Summon the Consecrated Mind. Here, you must tether with a teammate to get a buff called Enlightened, which allows you to break the shield on enemies and kill them to prevent them from sacrificing. One group stays at home to defend, while the rest goes around the map clearing enemies and activating portals by tethering the boxes. After all of the portals are set up, roamers will typically teleport back and forth to rebuff their teammates staying on the 4 different positions to defend. After killing all of the waves of adds and angelics, the middle section will open up where you can tether again and kill more waves of adds to finish the job. This encounter has some really cool mechanics for the tethering, but I've always felt like it gets really boring. Staying in one spot for so long can be really tedious, and I always wished it would move just a bit faster. When I'm not playing a roamer position in a group, I feel like I'm practically falling asleep. It doesn't require all that much communication, and I think this is probably the least fun fight in the raid, especially since it doesn't even include a boss to fight. I'm going to put this one in the C tier. Next up is the Consecrated Mind. You'll have one team babysitting the Consecrated Mind while picking up those voltaic overloads and shooting the correct set of eyes to prevent a wipe. Meanwhile, another group will be playing Gambit by picking up motes that drop from the Minotaurs, which can be deposited at a Spire to get that Enlightened buff to break shields and prevent Vex from sacrificing. Once 30 motes are deposited without any sacrifices, it's time for damage and the Consecrated Mind will be drawn to the Spire. Here, you need to first break the eyes to start dealing damage, and then do as much DPS as possible while chasing the Consecrated Mind down the hallway. If you don't deal enough damage to one phase, you're starting the whole process over again. I tend to find this fight actually pretty fun for a mid-raid fight. I think it's possibly even on the same level as some of the fights from the middle of the Last Wish, like Shuro Chi and the Vault. It requires a lot of communication to manage shooting the proper set of eyes, as well as depositing the motes in a timely enough manner so that you don't run out of the buff to prevent sacrifices. The DPS phase is also really fun while chasing the mind down the hallway, and it's really satisfying if you can pull off a one phase. I'm going to put this one up in the A tier. And lastly, we have the final boss, the Sanctified Mind. Here, you shoot out either the shoulder or the knee of the boss, which creates a portal to a side of the map filled with enemies that drop motes of light. Teams of 2 will collect as many motes as possible, and then call for teammates to shoot the weak spot again in order to pull you back and open up another portal. As your teammates are entering the new portal to grab their set of motes, you're depositing your motes into a relay that gives you an Enlightened buff, allowing you to break the shields of Vex who are coming to sacrifice at the relay. Once you've deposited 30 motes without sacrifices, the relay is charged and pulsing with energy. At the same time as all of this is happening, the boss will be disintegrating platforms under your feet in the main boss room, and your building team will need to tether particular spots to rebuild those platforms. After a period of time, the boss will create a blue or orange lock structure in the middle of the air, and your team will need to tether this to the correct color of the relay. If done quickly enough, it's time for damage where your team can choose to either deal as much damage as possible now, or do another tether to extend the damage phase. Dealing enough damage to kill the boss will end the encounter, otherwise you're repeating the whole cycle again. It was interesting getting feedback from friends about this encounter for the video. The general consensus seemed to be that this encounter is pretty cool looking, but not really all that fun for some reason. I think frustrations with the tethering are a big part of that, especially when your team is not in sync with rebuilding the platforms while also trying to deposit motes and defend the Vex from sacrificing. However, I do think this encounter requires a decent amount of communication and personal responsibility while managing these mechanics, which is a plus in my book. I think this one deserves a spot in the A tier. So that wraps up our tier list. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with my placements. Also, let me know what is your favorite and least favorite encounter in the game. I'd really love to hear from you. This video was a little bit different from my normal PvP content, and if you like it and want to see more PvE focused stuff, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up rating. It's free to do and it lets YouTube know that other people might find this video interesting. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on your post notifications so you don't miss my next video. I stream every week over on Twitch, and you can catch me live over at twitch.tv/pattycakespc. And finally, if you're looking for a great place to find some teammates to play games with, our community Discord is an awesome place to hang out and it's growing really fast. We have about 2,500 members now, and it's been really cool to meet some of you guys inside the server. That's all for now, catch you guys next time.